Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I had the pleasure to speak with Joel Simon. Joel is a fascinating creator who works at the intersection of art and computational research, particularly in the realm of AI and creativity. He is the creator of Artbreeder, a biologically inspired tool for navigating the space of AI images, but has also worked on many other projects, such as evolving floor plans, a digital puppet theater, and generating computational paintbrushes. He is also the author of a new essay entitled Beyond Slop, which explores how to think about creativity in AI. Joel and I had a chance to discuss how he thinks about his work, the nature of evolutionary algorithms and his interest in them, and the origins of Artbreeder. We also spent time discussing his new essay and the need for creating computational tools that expand self-expression rather than limiting it, and how to think more broadly about creativity in AI. This conversation was fascinating and full of many insights, and I had a great time speaking with Joel. Let's begin. Joel, so good to be chatting with you, and welcome to the Orthogonal Bet.
Likewise, great to see you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited for this. So you do a lot of wild and interesting things, and I want to talk about all your different projects, but maybe it would be fun to kind of start with something both on the surface simpler, but probably actually much more difficult to answer, which is when you're talking to people, how do you describe yourself and your work? How do you, or even just how do you think about it for yourself?
That's a good question, and it's something I haven't mastered at all, and I'm iterating on. And people have told me I need to work on the narrative. I would say sometimes the honest answer is I just kind of get to wake up and explore what I think is interesting that day. That's kind of been the last 10 years, more or less. I would say if I was trying to make it a little better articulated, I'm just trying to explore creativity for myself and for enabling it in others through technology, creating new interfaces with technology, exploring what's possible, I guess.
Okay, no, that sounds good. And yeah, I want to talk more about creativity more broadly. But yeah, maybe we could start with one of your projects, which is deeply creative, which is, I guess, it started as GAN Breeder and then it became Artbreeder. Yes. But maybe, talk about what that project is and kind of how it got started.
Absolutely. And one other thing is sometimes I'll say artist, toolmaker, and researcher, which sounds like a lot. And sometimes I say I'm in between all of those and not.
I was going to say, they're all deeply intertwined in what you're actually doing.
Yeah, I think once I had a diagram and I was I do a little bit of each. I'm not a full-time, I guess I am a full-time researcher now, but historically I haven't been a full-time researcher or not just a AI product CEO, but I've kind of a little bit of each of those mixed together in this weird mix. Is maybe the other answer how I would describe myself.
I like that.
If I was given more time. And so happy to talk about GAN Breeder, Artbreeder. It was back in 2018 for those who remember. GANs had recently come out. Big GAN from Google was one. That was kind of the state of the art for image generation technology. And at the time, I was very interested in evolutionary algorithms, interactive evolutionary algorithms. It had gotten deep into.
Do you want to explain a little bit what an evolutionary algorithm is? Just everyone's on the same page. Yeah.
Totally. And so, before, this wave of, let's call it deep learning, image synthesis things, you might see a lot of with generating images and audio and video. There was kind of this earlier era of algorithms where it was more biologically inspired. It wasn't necessarily, I think the key difference is using data sets as much, but you'd kind of create these simple representations and you would do this kind of biologically inspired process of basically trying a lot of things and keeping the things that worked and repeating. And that would kind of allow you to get novel creation. So famously, I think NASA invented antenna that way. There was kind of this in the late 90s, early 2000s wave of virtual life and other kind of generations. And I think that inspired a lot of people because they were, I guess the term we would use now is additive distribution, but things that humans would not have considered. And so that kind of those types of algorithms have been inspiring to a lot of people like myself because of, and also this biological kind of connection as well, I think made it kind of more evocative. And so I had been doing some kind of research in how do you design things with generative algorithms or what are the interfaces or controls for it. I wanted to not just generate things, but kind of make things for myself in terms of floor plans, architecture, or sculpture, which we're going to. And so I'm thinking a lot about kind of with genetic algorithms, you have to kind of represent the thing you're creating somehow. You have to kind of design what is its internal representation, which may sound a little technical, but it's kind of at the heart of crafting a genetic algorithm. You're the thing's evolving. What's its DNA basically? It's to create the DNA of the
Right,
thing
and
you
then
want to
figure out like,
design.
yeah, like how, the way in which like the DNA, like the genotype kind of maps onto the phenotype, like the actual representation. And then right, and then and it turns out right that that process is highly non-trivial. Like there's a lot of art and skill involved in figuring out what that internal representation should be.
Yeah, it's a weird. I guess now everything's been subsumed by deep learning, but at the time it's kind of like that is the art or the craft of like picking your genetic representation. And so that's kind of the work I was doing for a little bit with like floor plans. Like, what is the DNA of a floor plan? It's kind of a weird question, but actually was very like central to the process. And so then when some of the GANs came out, I kind of come at it, I guess, from that perspective of like, actually, like with a lot of not to say technical, but like when you typically when you like have two children, like two floor plans have a child, both they might not resemble their parents, so they might just kind of be not valid. And so this is a problem you just say you're working on, like I want floor plan children to look like their parents or something. But it's really actually an important problem with like the evolvability of it. And so realizing with
Right,
like
right,
GAN,
and I guess yeah, and just kind of like double down on that. Like the idea behind that is like right, if it's wildly different, then there's nothing for the algorithm to operate upon because if it right, if it's like you mutate a little bit and you get something completely different, then
right?
there's no gradient that you're kind of operating on. Like evolution kind of can't do its thing, right? Is that the kind of way to think about it?
It's a great way of saying it. And like if 9 out of 10 times it's not a valid solution,
Right.
you also can't do your thing. And so you want to have your mom's eyes and your dad's hair or something like that. And um right, so you want to have those properties in your like floor plan evolution system. And so which is kind of a hard thing to do. And then with the GANs, this newer technology having this concept of like latent space, where you kind of smoothly interpolate, which is kind of this other way of operating or working or mechanisms, kind of just seeing those connections. They're like, oh, you could just kind of cross over by crossing these latent vectors together, which just kind of was felt like a really fun way to synthesize the benefits of both. And so I had originally been inspired by this project called Pickbreeder by Kenneth Stanley, which is kind of an earlier human in the loop evolutionary algorithm. And I remember just kind of walking down the street and being like, someone should really do Pickbreeder with Big GAN. Like, someone really ought to do that. And then I kind of just took a weekend to do it, essentially, like a very caffeinated weekend. And so at the time, just like I guess to make it clear to folks, to interact with this technology, you would load like a Python code, like a Python notebook, and you would type in some random values, and you would get an image out. And you would be like a string of like 100 random numbers, and you would say this is a hamburger, and you get like a random hamburger. And so it's very, very technical. You would just give it this list of 100 random numbers and like what kind of image it was, you'd get the thing out. People were starting to poke around with this. And so that's obviously not the most usable interface. Just trying to make it basically like this kind of biological metaphor. So you could kind of like all those things in the latent space suddenly kind of became much more playful and collaborative and public. So everyone could branch off each other, kind of inspired by Pickbreeder and building off it as well. And so yeah, it started off like a weekend project, and I think I emailed it to like a handful of people, I think including yourself, and then just tweeted it, and that was kind of the origins of it.
Yeah, and so, I mean, and eventually, right, it took off, and then like GAN Breeder, which I then kind of became, I guess, was rebranded as Artbreeder. It seems as if, and maybe you can kind of correct me or kind of provide more detail. Like it was definitely adopted by a great deal of artists and kind of the art community. That being said, I mean, it was very clearly kind of AI art. Like, how were at least, and because again, maybe we have to like transport ourselves back into like
Right.
2018. How was the artistic community engaging with AI at the time, and how did they respond to Artbreeder?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, like the evolution of the reactions to it and kind of like stumbling into the forefront of it, I would suppose, and seeing like the different communities kind of come through. I would say when it first came out, it was a lot of people who were kind of just like really early adopter type people, people who like experimenting with art and technology or kind of like see themselves at the forefront of it. Um, and then follow people over the years, seeing them go kind of like one forefront to another, and having them kind of pass through in the beginning, people who are kind of like experimental new media artists, just people who are just kind of like pioneers of art and technology, I guess. And just trying to, it was exciting because it was so new and different and weird, I think, and clearly an experiment. And so I think, and it also something I've heard and appreciated at the time is it clearly felt very homemade. The app, it didn't feel like a big company made it, and so I think I didn't realize it was the first. In fact, it felt like a kind of personal project. And it was also very inviting to people, and so I got basically connected to all these people who were kind of like pioneers in art and AI at the time, who were just like, oh, this is like we're all kind of figuring this out together. So that way it felt very communal. And I think the app itself was very communal. Like people could donate, like community members volunteered to like commit code to it. People like like community members like trained their own GAN models and like gave them to me to host on the platform.
Wow.
So I think it did not feel like corporate at all. I think maybe that's also a key distinction. It felt like kind of like an art research experiment that was very community oriented. And so in the beginning, it felt like a big experiment. And also the fact that they weren't resembling specific artist styles, I think was very important too. I think the fact you were clearly building up from these like universal primitives, if you call them that, like an iPod plus a hamburger, right? Like and that was very non-threatening as well. It just kind of this like weird experiment of early adopters. And over time that like it went through these stages of evolution as well. But the beginning everyone was like kind of getting their minds blown of like what could be possible.
Yeah, and then I mean, and you mentioned like you were kind of connecting to these different communities. Yeah, and I imagine probably one feature of it was like everyone kind of had a stake in it, which probably helped with that. But initially, were you connected to these specific artistic communities, or was it through the actual tool you kind of got plugged into these worlds and kind of began to kind of see what was going on there?
I had some connections. A lot of it came through Artbreeder, Artbreeder. I mean, I'd studied art and computer science undergrad, and then kind of like
Mhm.
got a little, I guess, disconnected from the field for a couple years. In New York, I went into my like corals and floor plan cave for like a year or two. It felt it's like I got a little detached maybe, and then this kind of yeah. In that way, it's interesting because the community was also like the AI art community, like Pictures to Reflect On was so small back then that you could basically like kind of meet or get connected to everyone.
Oh, it's interesting.
Because like scans are kind of niche and weird. Like and it's very hard to explain it to someone and be like, oh, I'm like, breeding these evolution like AI images and like no one like that meant that was a very confusing statement. Which is also interesting to reflect back on now. And so no, a lot of it kind of came through the tool, getting connected to people, and coming out to San Francisco, coming out to the Bay Area, through it. And so yeah, you never know what a weird weekend project will could lead
Yeah,
to.
yeah. No, and you also mentioned like the extent to which it felt non-threatening to a lot of the artists' work because they're kind of like combining things in lots of different ways. There's no pre-existing style. I imagine some of the stuff now would have this kind of distinctive style of like kind of AI art kind of style, like certainly from that time period. It was very different than some of the kind of AI image generation tools that we're more familiar with, maybe or at least more recently, where you give it a prompt and often will say, okay, here is the style that it should be made in. Like this was much more exploratory as opposed to kind of objective driven. I don't know. Is that the right way to describe it?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think no one had even like considered like mixing an iPod with a hamburger and then subtracting like velvet dress from it. You know what I mean? Like it was like, what does it even mean to like have negative like velvet dress? Like
Yeah.
it was a whole new way of even thinking about like images and exploration. And so in that way, yeah, it's kind of like discovery for everyone. And even like I didn't quite appreciate or know like how vast the space would be. Like I think also like it unlocked like the interface unlocked a lot from the technology because like a lot of the best images would have like hundreds of these like components to them. And so typically like the paper was just trained on like you're a hamburger, you're an iPod, right? Or you're like a dress. But here you could be like have hundreds of things mixed together and it had this like fascinating extrapolative ability that in some ways is the high water mark to this point. Like no model can really kind of go out of distribution meaningfully that way almost accidentally. Or for instance, something else that I thought was quite interesting was that because the UI wasn't like you could basically like edit the HTML yourself, and people just started putting negative values in, which I never planned on. But
Oh,
it turned
interesting.
out a lot of the best images would be like negative values. And so in that way, like the the site was kind of malleable or breakable. These things got discovered. So yeah, I felt much more like a big exploration or discovery than like creating something specific. And I think it's also interesting that like a lot of the discussions around like authorship and ownership that came with AI images kind of happened a few years earlier with GAN Like in 2019, we had people like fighting over ownership of images. Like a few years before, kind of that happened again in the mainstream. So a lot of like the cultural norms hadn't evolved yet. Like if you make this weird image and I branch it, who owns it? And at the time, there were real people fighting over that. Of course, like as the culture had evolved, and I think like the inherent value of the images kind of like maps their true value, like the perceived and true ones kind of came together. Like people stopped fighting over these GAN images. But I think the other thing was like I always tried to frame it as like so everything in the website is like public domain. And so I try to I sidestep all the ownership stuff as well. But in that way, also like some of these like same waves around ownership and stuff kind of passed through Artbreeder like earlier in a smaller scale.
Yeah, maybe you can talk a little bit about like some of those debates. Like I'd love to hear kind of like what people were kind of discussing. Art clearly has a history of like you want to you want to be original, but also everything has sort of a combinatorial recombination aspect to it. Like everything is a remix kind of idea. How were the users grappling with these issues? Like what were the specific debates they were having, and like how did they kind of how did they end up getting resolved if they did?
Yeah, I don't want to call out any people in particular. I think well, it's interesting that maybe one thing to note is like a little bit later, like the rise of like our Artbreeder's timing coincided kind of with like the early NFT wave as well, which is kind of interesting coincidence. Kind of so a lot of people were also like making AI images themselves NFTs. That kind of
Oh,
was where
interesting.
some of the desire to kind of stake them out came from. And I think like when you make something, it's kind of very, very natural to want to feel proud of what you made, which is an interesting tension for me as the creator of the tool. It's kind of something that's continued over the years. Is I tried to, Artbreeder for me was kind of like an artwork that we're all co-creating, right? Like it's kind of like creative superorganism. We're all exploring the latent space together. We're all deeply intertwined. A lot of creativity, as you said, is like deeply connected. I was very inspired by the systems approach to creativity, and seeing as one big organism, everyone's kind of helping each other explore. And so that's why I kind of very intentionally try to make it all public domain. That's kind of, what it is. And, at what threshold, people got really interested in being like, well, what you could analyze the genome and kind of like do a mathematical analysis of like exactly how related his images are and find some kind of like cutoff point and all this kind of stuff. But for me, it was always like these are kind of like these kind of like mechanizing as like inspiration for a discovery process. They're kind of like creative stepping stones. And for me, like the people who would take the images and then they would like you know, heavily paint over them, or they would make dresses out of them, or they would collage them together. They're kind of these like inspiration building blocks. That was kind of like my intention in kind of supporting that. I think people, yeah, if they like if they spent a few hours reading an image, they understandably wanted to feel ownership over it, wanted to be able to sell it, wanted to be able to like feel proud of it. I think it's a very natural instinct with the creative process. So as a tool maker, you have to kind of like it's hard to be like no, you didn't really like. It's not really yours. So that was always, I think, a tension and remains a tension with some of this AI work. But I think eventually, over time, people like to kind of like in 2021, 2022, you'd go to a gallery and see like a Mid-Journey print on the wall, and I think that stopped because like this is kind of like a gap between like the perceived value and real value, and then everyone gets to understand the technology, and it gets more mainstream, and then like people stop just framing Mid-Journey images and putting them on the wall.
Yeah, yeah. Well, right. And I feel like these kinds of like the norms, like they're constantly evolving. Like as we're kind of learning more about the tools, as the tools are becoming democratized, like that also changes kind of what is considered art, what is considered original.
Totally, totally. So yeah, those debates have kind of like thankfully stopped over the years, but yeah, it was interesting seeing them at least in the beginning.
That's so interesting. I guess I mean, so I want to talk more about creativity. I want to take a step back though to like some of the biological stuff. And you mentioned like kind of the like you kind of got very early on in like thinking about like generating these corals and like evolving floor plans. What was the origin, I guess, of your interest in kind of these like evolutionary algorithms and kind of like biologically inspired computational approaches?
There are a few kind of let's say like threads that kind of intertwined over the years. I think like during and after college, I was very interested in like computational sculpture. So um maybe going back a little earlier, like one thing that kind of like I was doing a lot of figure sculpture in college. And also I studied art and computer science and it's kind of they hadn't quite fully combined. And I remember like during one of the crits they were like, why are you doing all this figure sculpture? Like this stuff already exists. And at the time I was a little annoyed because like, like a violinist wouldn't get that critique. Like, why are you doing this? Like we already have this music. But I think it kind of like grew on me and I think like that kind of like set me off in this like 10, 15-year journey of like how can I create in a way that's both like the kind of like the hands-on kind of joy of like creating with your hands, but also like really like working with these new technologies, not and not just like digitally, but computationally. Like there's a lot of sculpture software that was kind of like mimicking real sculpture, which I would call like digital versus like computational sculpture. And so I think that at the end of college kind of kicked me off in this like 15-year quest, let's call it that, of like how do I get like this joy of trading in a way that's like meaningfully computational. And so I think a lot of stuff has kind of come from that early process. And so when I worked in a kind of bioinformatics lab a little bit after college. And so like while PCR runs were running, I have time to kind of like hack on stuff. And I think that kind of was some of the origins of like this kind of unimaginable like sublime complexity of like even just like a lymph node or like the immune system where the more you learn about it like kind of the more incredible it gets. And then I remember I was visiting a lab at MIT, and they were showing me like topology optimization, these like chairs where you would basically kind of have this like somewhat evolutionary a gradient type algorithm of like evolving a chair inspired by like the bones inside like a bird, where you had like incredibly emergent forms that looked like nothing a human would design, but yet felt very like physically intuitive, if that makes sense. And I remember seeing this like topology optimized chair, and like a lot of stuff kind of clicked together for me, where it was something so beautiful and that felt right, but like no one could have conceived of. And so I think like that kind of got me thinking of like how can you create these things that you could not conceive on your own and kind of create in a way that's like beyond your own cognitive abilities and surprise yourself. And so I think those pieces all kind of came together.
No, I love that. And I think, I mean, I'm also deeply interested in these kinds of things as well. And
Yeah.
as you were talking, I was trying to think about even just like my own reasons behind why I find these kind of things interesting. I'm sure there's many reasons, but like certainly one of them is kind of related to what you're saying, which is this kind of evolutionary approach is sort of a subset of this kind of larger thing within computing where you can take this like relatively small set of rules and it creates this sort of like emergent combinatorial explosion. And like there's just like this massive outpouring of complexity. And that is often surprising, not necessarily intuitive, not necessarily predictable, at least from first principles. And that's amazing. And and just kind of getting to see what's out there. And certainly like evolution as a computational algorithm is a kind of one of those examples. And I've written some stuff around like emergent
Yes.
microcosms and these kinds of things.
Yes.
Right, like they are really exciting to see. So yeah, your explanation certainly resonated with me.
No, I think you can tell some people have gotten, I think like us and like others, people we know, like you can get this bug of who has like he's been bit by the bug of like seeing these like emergent systems on their computer, and kind of wanting to recreate those and watching these things kind of unfold. Yet I've been reflecting upon like the distinction between these kind of like bottom up like emergent systems versus kind of like I think more like top down kind of like data set based things where you're more like sampling from a data set, which is kind of in a way where things have evolved, and so like that's been interesting, like tension for me now coming at it from like this bottom up emergent inspiration to have it kind of like AI field turn into this more like bottom down, just kind of like surfing the space of other people's data sets. But yes, I think biologically, and then I got really into this idea of like dog breeding as a design interface, and so I think for me, I was always interested in like having these generative systems, but then also like the joy of actually like into like creating things myself. I think it's one thing to just like kick it off and observe it, but if someone has done like hands-on stuff, wanting to find that balance, like it's just kind of generative emergent system, but I also want to like be in the loop. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of also been another like tension or constraint kind of between these two different ways of thinking and trying to like mediate those. Like, what does it feel actually control it? And so I got very inspired by this metaphor of like dog breeding. I'm not sure where it originated, but like often I'll ask people like what's the most complicated thing humans have ever designed? And I've kind of like ruined the punchline here, but they might say like a nuclear reactor or the space station or something like that, ASML machine, what have you. But I kind of like to say what's actually like, if you want to at least to the order of like tens of trillions of cells in terms of number of parts, like it's actually kind of dogs if you think about it. And not just the scale of complexity, but think about like the design process behind that. It was decentralized, right? There's no in the beginning at least going from wolves. It was collaborative, it was locally adaptive. Like each region got dogs suited toward different tasks. They are useful for companionship, for hunting, sheep herding, right? And like they do all these different things for us. And we kind of designed them from wolves in a way where there was no like PhD in advanced dog design you had to like take in order to like do this incredibly complicated thing. Compared to technology now, where like who has the ability to design a super skyscraper? I don't know. The number of firms is probably in the order of a dozen in the world. I don't know, right? But here, like anyone in the whole world could do it, and you got these very locally adaptive ones. And it was so easy, people didn't even know they were doing it, right? They're selecting, the process was like radically simple. You're just like selecting the best wolf of each litter. And so anyway, like that is an interesting like a way to like interface with complexity or make complex design systems like accessible, where we're designing something like so far beyond what we could conceive, but I'd argue like we did design it. So yeah, that kind of biological kind of like both in terms of like the interface, but also kind of like the emergent systems.
Oh, that's fascinating. Um, And related to that, I mean, and so after you kind of did Artbreeder, you then kind of created this like larger kind of umbrella for what you're doing of Morphogen. Was that kind of the larger overarching kind of aims around like kind of using biological inspiration, thinking about interfaces for grappling with huge amounts of complexity that are kind of intuitive. Anyone can kind of use it. Was that sort of like the overarching theme with, especially with Morphogen more broadly?
Yeah, I would say originally, so right before Gambreeder, I was doing some like working with actually architects on like weird experimental floor plan algorithms. And then after Artbreeder, it wasn't even really intentional necessarily. It kind of like that was the vision behind Morphogen being kind of this, like parent organization, Morphogens being this kind of like chemical component that helps organize growth in the system, decentralized ways, like decentralized agents that give rise to form. And so the studio Morphogen was kind of like, yeah, funded by Gambreeder, which became Artbreeder later. And then we did a bunch of basically like experiments and creativity. So it ended up becoming, I would say the AI wave happened. The studio was focused a lot on like how do you take these new technologies and make them accessible and I would say like playful, try to find like where's the room for craft. And so I think like the thesis on Morphogen evolved a little bit almost, yeah, it kind of evolved being like we're in this middle of this crazy wave of new technology. It became almost like a reaction, I would say. I would say in 2020 already, I was kind of we didn't have the term for it first. We didn't have the word slop then. But basically by the end of like 2020, early 21, I was already tired of like the GAN images, particularly the faces that were going viral at the time. And so I think I got exposed to all my images a lot earlier than other people, and so it was like a
Right,
little
you were sort of like it was like the hipster version. It's like, oh, I've already been there. I'm over it. It's like this is already.
a little bit. I mean, I had to see so many of them too, right? There was intention where as it went mainstream with like this early where like the really weird experimental images kind of like had its early wave of like early adopters, and then as it went mainstream, a lot of the artists kind of using the weirder part of it, and then it went mainstream. It kind of became more for like character creation, and I would see these things trending on Twitter, like Harry Potter's AI face, and I'd be like, I'd cringe. And so the faces and kind of making portraits were kind of brought it to the mainstream and it went like TikTok viral at the end of 2020. But like the faces were never really what I was passionate about, like the novel aesthetics. And also I would say like as I mentioned, like the feeling of like craft and control or like was kind of what I was interested in. But I think I had also caught this bug of like seeing artists developing their practices on the early system, and that deeply inspired me. I think seeing like, oh, like if you can offer a new medium, you'll enable new types of artists. And I think like even today, people are like, oh, AI images are just reproducing stuff. I think like maybe I was still deeply inspired by like this early wave where like actually did like enable new artists to find new ways of creating and new processes around it. And so there's a lot of the work of the studio has been around how do you turn these into tools that actually have the capacity for craft and self-expression? How do you kind of push these mediums further? And that rather than just means of like production essentially. And that's what kind of was a lot of the other tools in the studio kind of end up being inspired by less directly biological.
Okay, yeah, and because and this and you had a you mentioned slop, and you have this essay you just published called Beyond Slop, which is and basically kind of articulating a lot of this. And I want to talk to you more about it because you're kind of in the piece, and I think it echoes with what you just said. You're sort of two minds, like okay, like this stuff is really interesting, but in many cases, people are using it in non-interesting ways. Maybe that's like overly harsh. And so your goal, and I think you kind of even use this phrase of like trying to see the hand of the creator in AI output, which
Yeah.
I think is probably a really wise way of thinking about it, which is not to say, okay, we can never use AI, but the question becomes how do we still use it as this, I don't know, vector for self-expression? So yeah, so maybe you can kind of talk a little bit about the ideas around like unexpectedness and the creativity in the essay, and then maybe and you can also even mention some of the tools that you kind of developed in the context of trying to articulate these kinds of approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. This essay was kind of like it's a bit of a summary of like it's the last 6 years of my like reflecting on being in the field and kind of like finding myself as like running a tool that produced a lot of slop while also feeling like deeply unsatisfied and like critical of it. You know what I mean? And like it never really what I wanted. Like, it didn't even have this tool that you're kind of like your identity is connected to, but like not liking the outputs of it. You know what I mean? Or like not as much anymore. This is the way it's used for now. And I think to be fair, like there's nothing wrong with pushing images that way. There's a lot of slop. I love dancing cats. It's like very joyful. There's like a value in like cheap mimetic image production. If you need a poster, if I need a slide in a slideshow, I'll AI generate it. You know what I mean? And I think that's a lot of people see AI images now. But I think seeing it at a earlier period where in a way it was more expressive and open-ended and seeing artists actually able to like get their start on it and find their own voice. That's what's meaningful to me. And I think like I'm interested in like creative expression and like, that means not just discovering things that are new. I think being able to create new aesthetics is very important, but also things that are unique and honest to yourself, right? And so I think that's a lot of the role of creativity is the fact of like it's not self-expression, but kind of self-discovery in a way. And so like, me personally, like when I design and build my lamps, I think there's a kind of maybe it's almost like spiritual part of creativity. Like they become a part of you or an extension of yourself, right? We reflect it in the world. And I think that's important where people have access to it. And I think that new technologies can open up new new venues. And so like there's the artist in Artbreeder. I'm inspired by like Flash, right? Like a whole era of Flash games or Flash artists got started because of that technology, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And they might not have had a medium otherwise. Like, maybe oil painting or sculptures is not for you or it's not accessible, right? Like you do have the ability to enable new types of art and allow new artists. And I think that's a really powerful thing. That's what I'm motivated by. I thought that doesn't have to be the only reason to use these tools, but that's what motivates me. And I think it's something that kind of got like um forgotten a little bit over the years. And so one of the reflections is that's kind of like my tension. And I think it's been interesting to see like over the years the field has kind of converged. So each generation of technology has gotten better and better at creating what was in its data set and worse at going beyond it. And so the original Big GAN was never intended, they never like articulated like, oh, our goal is to create weird, wacky, surrealist things out of distribution that no one's seen before. It just accidentally was incredibly good at it. And each generation, the Clip VQ GAN, if those are familiar, had its own weird aesthetic. And the earlier models had some of their own aesthetic, but they weren't unique to an individual. But over time, they don't even have their own aesthetic. They get better and better at matching the distribution, at worse at going beyond it. And this idea that like in my mind, a lot one of the highest aspirations is actually create new artistic mediums. People can create stuff that they can deserve to feel proud of, right? They can actually find their own voice. I don't think it has to be a new aesthetic for the sake of new aesthetic, although that's exciting to me also to find new aesthetics. But you're gonna look at it and like, see the person inside of it. And so they kind of lead to a bit of reflection, like why is it that AI tools produce slop so much? Like what is it mechanically that gives rise to the ability to someone to express themselves, like a spirograph versus clay, for instance. Spirograph is like very restrictive, and you can do some cool things in it probably, but you would never create something where it's like I can recognize that person by their spirograph output. And that's kind of what we're doing, or like giving people. And
Yeah.
but then we're kind of also subtly telling them like they made this, which I think is like a little unfortunate, or like the Brett Victor essay on like, humane representation of thought. Like it feels like it's a little bit inhumane. We're not giving people like, like would I rather my kids be doing text to image or actually like learning to sketch or watercolor, but I think it doesn't have to. I think technology can create new mediums that do have that rich capacity as well. And that's some of the thinking behind the essay. And so I can get into kind of like that's kind of like the framing of it maybe. I don't know if I get too
Yeah,
much.
this is good. And yeah, and maybe you can kind of talk about, and I would love to have like a few examples of some of the tools that you kind of developed that hopefully kind of evoked the kind of self-expression you're looking for. And also, and if there's other sort of like new media that you feel also are kind of more on the side of what you're hoping for that you can also.
Yeah, absolutely. In like early 2021, when the studio, like we first kind of like I first hired people, like half of our effort was toward this experimental puppet theater, actually, which was kind of like a reaction, very much like a 180 from the GAN kind of portraits. And so for that one, I was very interested in like traditional craft practices actually. And so researching about like traditional shadow puppet culture in like Southeast Asia. I mean, most cultures have some form of puppetry, marionettes in Europe, different forms of shadow puppetry from like, Turkey to Bali to Korea, all have some kind of form of shadow puppetry. And what was interesting to me just looking at the images, was these images or these puppets from like 1,000 or 2,000 years ago are still so beautiful and striking and evocative and like and kind of this timeless beauty to them. And in a way they're a piece of like cut out leather on a stick, right? The technology is quite relatively low. And then even in 2020 you would see these like waves of technology come out and they would feel dated a month later as a newer technology came out and kind of like the aura of newness of the previous one evaporated for this replacement and the old one was put in the dustbin. And someone who cares about, the beauty and the quality of the outputs, like that was really interesting to me. Like, why can we not produce something timeless and beautiful with this technology, but a piece of leather on a stick could, And it was so accessible. I think some cultures they would do it in the off season, when they weren't working in the fields. The village would come together and do shadow puppetry together collectively, right? And so it was about storytelling, tradition, community. And so the puppet theater is kind of based on that thinking of like embracing accessible, playful, collaborative craft as like the opposite of AI slap. And so it's also kind of in the pandemic when kind of web arts, like online collaborative spaces were kind of popular.
Mhm.
So puppets was kind of our main exploration and kind of craft and process. And so the puppet theater is like this kind of like paper craft you could pin and put strings and connect your strings to your fingers, and with hand tracking in the browser, kind of like you could build these puppets and perform them and do it in real time with other people. And so also interested in this idea of like play and craft being deeply connected. Like if you're playing Legos with your friends, you're like, it's a car and now it's a plane, and you're kind of going back between like playing and improvising in this feedback loop. So the space where you can kind of like play and improvise with other people, where the process was actually more important than the output. Like the experience of creating it was emphasized over like the quality of the output, which I think is what those are kind of the values that I think were and are important to me. And so that was the puppet theater kind of like one
Well,
experiment.
and what sort of groups adopted the puppet theater?
Not many.
Okay. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, it ended up being a lot of people talk about it and like
Okay.
reference it. I think it ended up not being widely. Yeah, it wasn't the future of generative AI the way I hoped. Because you could also directly tie it to the diffusion models too. Is another
Oh,
experiment I did
interesting.
where
Okay.
you could that was kind of the original motivation, which was that like there's so much outside of language. For
Mhm.
instance, like the subtle motion of like subtle movement, right? That's very hard to articulate. The way a fish jumps in and out of the water, for instance, or the way like, a leaf would fall, something you can't really articulate but can express very naturally in your hand. And so there's a version of it where you could kind of like puppet things that would directly input the diffusion process. And so you can kind of like control the diffusion process with these like hand guided things. This is back in 2020. I mean, now there's like video to video stuff. It's kind of a little bit analogous. And so it became more of like a proof of concept or a theory. And I think hosted a few workshops, people made stuff, but I think it was a little bit, yeah, it ended up not getting a wider. I didn't really market it maybe as much as I could have. It became more of like an experimental proof of concept.
Are there any mediums that people have like that you guys have not built, but that you also think are these good example of kind of an using AI and computation, but in sort of a self-expressive sort of way, as opposed to one that kind of limits that.
Good question. I feel like there are. They're not coming to me at the moment. So I think there may be folks using AI in subtler, more nuanced ways. I think there are branches of research is like, what does it mean to be like an instrument, right? Where it has a kind of flavor, but you're able to control it real time over time. Where it's more like AI as an instrument. There's some research around that. In terms of public tools, in a way, a lot of the most interesting stuff is artists who are working with the technology more intimately, kind of like working more deeply with it, and kind of hacking the models, breaking the models. That's often where the most interesting stuff happens, which is like not really accessible through these kind of like polished interfaces that only offer a very select amount of like control over it. You basically have your prompt box and not much else. So I would
Mhm.
say like there's a whole world of artists who are going deeper, working directly with the technology, breaking it, hacking it, extending it, using it in ways it wasn't intended for. That is quite interesting. So in a way, I feel like there's things like how do you allow users to break the technology in their own way, which is not how a lot of the tools now I think are thinking about it.
Okay, I like that. And I guess maybe for kind of the last question or kind of part of our discussion, you mentioned Pick Breeder, which was developed by Ken Stanley, and you were talking about stepping stones, and you are currently working with Ken Stanley. I'd love to
Yeah.
kind of hear more about kind of what you're currently working on, either in that context or kind of more broadly. And it sounds like you're also like thinking a lot about creativity and open-endedness and these kinds of ideas.
Yeah. So now I am working with Ken Stanley at his open-endedness lab at a company called Lila. So Ken, as I mentioned, was the creator, along with Jimmy and some others, of something called Pick Breeder, which is very inspiring to me and others. And Gan Breeder was named after Pick Breeder. It's basically, I conceive of it as like Pick Breeder with GANs. It's basically it. I saw it as kind of combinatorial in that sense. So the group is focused on open-endedness. Grew out of some of and this is something that Joel Layman and Ken Stanley, I mean, it's kind of something that they've pioneered and can speak to best and have done a lot of interviews on.
Yeah,
But
and we've actually had Ken
yeah,
on the
you've had
podcast as
Ken.
well. Yeah. So,
Yes, absolutely. And so maybe I'll leave it to them to do a total coverage of what open-endedness is. But it's kind of but in short, it's this kind of other way of thinking where the role of algorithms aren't just to converge to some optimal answer. Like I want the best X, and a lot of computer science is conceived or framed around like give me, optimize toward a single goal. Where open-endedness is more inspired by culture and biology, where discoveries lead to more discoveries perpetually, and kind of this like unfolding process that is inherently hard to predict and can't be planned. And so that's been inspiring. A lot of the algorithms have been inspiring to me as like an artist and toolmaker, building systems that kind of connect how like the algorithms and creative processes all work. And so, yeah, I wasn't planning on joining the lab or even getting a job ever, but really to work with Ken in this group and basically just kind of like pioneer open-endedness. I think it's like, and it's great that the Lila, the company, is focused on like scientific superintelligence, and they see open-endedness as like a key part of the scientific process. And so, yeah, so I've kind of gone to basically, I think I realized a lot of my motivation was kind of research focused. And so we're going to kind of just focus purely on research, still running Artbreeder as well. But this kind of allows me to do what kind of the original motivation was kind of just pure research in these generative open-ended systems.
That's fantastic. Yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. This has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, great to chat always. And yeah, I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you.